Chapter 1. The Whisper of Warpstone. The Blackfang sliced through the churning black waters of the Sea of Malice, its sleek hull blending with the obsidian waves beneath it. The ship, a masterpiece of Druchii craftsmanship, bore the scars of countless raids, deep gouges in its hull from enemy ballistae, charred streaks from sorcerous fire, and the faded crimson stains of old bloodshed. The jagged sails dyed the color of a fresh wound, billowed in the icy winds that rolled off the towering cliffs of Clare Caron. At the ship's prow stood Captain Vaedrith Nightbane, her silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. She was clad in a coat of deep violet lined with flayed human skin, its texture smooth from years of handling. A serrated cutlass hung at her hip, and a wickedly barbed lash coiled at her side, its leather stained dark with dried gore. Her eyes, cold as the abyss, fixed on the tattered scroll in her gloved hands. The map was ancient, its surface lined with the fine cracks of age. The symbols were alien, traced in a curling script that pulsed with an unnatural green luminescence. The mark of Warpstone. This was no mere plunder. This was power beyond reckoning. A cache of the Old One's cursed relics, hidden in the steaming hell of Lustria's jungles. If the legends were true, then what lay within those ruins could elevate her beyond mere piracy, beyond even the squabbling dreadlords of Naggaroth. Behind her, the crew gathered on the main deck, 100 twisted souls hardened by the cruelty of the sea and their own kin. Corsairs, their cloaks lined with the scaled hides of beasts slain in far-off lands. Reavers, their eyes gleaming with the fevered madness of endless slaughter. And, standing apart from them all, wrapped in a dark shroud, was Lysith's Velcor, the ship's sorceress. Lysith's presence was a cold thing, a void in the air around her. Her skin, unnaturally pale beneath the arcane glow of the map, seemed almost translucent, as though the darkness of the void itself seeped beneath her flesh. The winds curled unnaturally around her, whispering secrets that only she could hear. Vaedrith spoke, her voice cutting through the night like a dagger drawn across silk. "We sail for Lustria." The crew erupted in savage cheers, a discordant symphony of cruelty and hunger. Gold, slaves, and power, that was the promise that kept them loyal, for now. Yet beneath their exultation lurked something darker. Greed, yes, but also fear. Every dark elf knew of Lustria. It was a land of steaming death, where the trees themselves hungered for flesh, where serpentine monsters lurked beneath the emerald canopy, and where the Lizardmen, the cold-blooded sentinels of a dying empire, slaughtered invaders without mercy. Many who had sailed for its shores had never returned. Those who had were never whole again. Vaedrith welcomed their fear. Fear was a tool, and she wielded it as she did her blade. She turned to her first mate, Salith Vane, a towering figure wrapped in a coat of flayed Cold One hide. His face, angular and sharp as a dagger's edge, bore the marks of 100 battles. His left eye was missing, gouged out by a Skaven warlock's blade, but the void left behind was not empty. It shimmered, ever so faintly, with an emerald glow. "Make for the maelstrom," she ordered. "We take the hidden currents south. I want no delays." Salith gave a slow, knowing grin. He lived for the hunt. "And the crew?" he asked. "Shall I remind them of the price of failure?" Vaedrith's smirk was sharper than any blade. "Oh, let them enjoy their excitement. There will be plenty of reminders soon enough." Salith chuckled darkly and turned to bark orders to the deck. Drums thundered, rattling the bones of the ship itself as the rowers below deck bent to their oars. The Blackfang surged forward, cutting a path through the restless waters. Below deck, the blood ritual. Deep within the ship's bowels, beneath the heavy beams slick with seawater and rot, a sacrificial pit had been prepared. 10 human slaves knelt on the cold iron floor, their wrists bound, their throats raw from screaming. The scent of fear thickened the air, mixing with the iron tang of spilled blood. Lizardmen Velcor stood above them, her fingers moving in slow, deliberate gestures as she traced runes of power in the air. The ritual was necessary, a ward against the curses of the jungle, against the unseen horrors lurking beyond the veil. She murmured the first words of the incantation, and the first throat was cut, a gurgling scream swiftly drowned by the wet splash of blood against the iron grate. The warp glyphs flared, casting sickly green light across the chamber. One by one the slaves fell, their life force consumed, their souls ripped from their flesh and fed to the insatiable hungers of the dark gods. The final victim, a young Bretonnian noble, his face streaked with dirt and dried tears, looked up at Lizardmen, his lips moving in silent prayer. She smiled cruelly and slit his throat. The blood steamed as it touched the runes, and for a moment the air split, a whisper, a glimpse of something beyond reality, a ripple in the veil between worlds. The sacrifice was accepted. The gods were watching. Lizardmen turned from the corpses, her face flushed with the afterglow of power. The ship was ready. Lustria awaited. On the deck, a premonition of doom. As the Blackfang plunged into the night, Vaedrith felt it, a shiver down her spine, a whisper just at the edge of hearing, like the hiss of a serpent coiled in the shadows. She turned her gaze back to the map, its runes writhing, the glow of Warpstone pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Something was waiting in that jungle, something old, something that did not suffer intruders lightly. But the path was set, the sea carried them onward, and no dark elf had ever turned from the promise of power, no matter the cost. Chapter 2. Secrets of the Slann. The Blackfang cut through the morning haze, its jagged sails hanging limp as the humid air of Lustria choked the last whispers of the ocean wind. The ship glided through the black, sluggish waters of a hidden river, its hull barely disturbing the stillness. An unnatural silence hung over the jungle, so thick that even the croaking of unseen beasts and the distant reptilian calls of unseen predators seemed muted, as if the very land was holding its breath. At the bow, Captain Vaedrith Nightbane stood motionless, her gaze locked on the mist-shrouded ruins emerging from the vine-choked jungle. The temple city, or what remained of it, loomed ahead, half swallowed by centuries of encroaching vegetation. Massive stone structures carved in the image of monstrous reptiles rose from the jungle floor, their surfaces blackened with time and damp rot. "By the Dark Mother," First Mate Solid Vein muttered beside her. His hand rested on the hilt of his cutlass, fingers tight with instinctual caution. "This place is watching us." And he wasn't wrong. Even through the mist, enormous carvings of Slann visages loomed from every surface, their ancient stone eyes filled with silent judgment. The Drukei were no strangers to the power of dead gods, but this was different. There was something in the air here, something breathing. Behind them, the crew whispered among themselves, their voices filled with unease. Even the most hardened reavers shifted in their boots. They had fought humans, dwarfs, even the monstrous warriors of the Chaos Wastes, but Lustria was different. Here, the land itself seemed to hunger for intruders. Vaedrith exhaled, slow and measured. She would not allow superstition to weaken them. "Prepare a landing party," she ordered. "We move now." The jungle's teeth. The dark elves disembarked swiftly, their blackened steel boots sinking into the thick, wet loam. The jungle's scent was overpowering, the stench of decay, of wet earth, of something sour and unnatural lingering beneath it all. The ruins towered ahead, veiled in vines and thick with creeping mist. Colossal stone staircases, their surfaces warped with time, led upward toward a pyramid, its peak lost within the canopy of the jungle. Warped glyphs, written in an impossible language, glowed faintly in the dark recesses of the stone. The Lizardmen had abandoned this place long ago, but something remained, something that was never meant to be disturbed. The company moved forward, weapons drawn. The black-cloaked corsairs, their cloaks lined with reptilian scales from past hunts, stalked between the trees, eyes scanning for movement. Then they heard it. A low, hissing breath. The first scream came from the back of the column. Vaedrith spun, her blade drawn in a heartbeat, but the attack had already begun. From the shadows of the trees, serpentine creatures lunged. Bloated, writhing masses of sinew and fanged tendrils, their flesh pulsing with an eerie, phosphorescent glow. One corsair Keldros barely had time to scream before a mass of writhing vines lashed around his torso. The barbed tendrils sank deep, puncturing through armor, flesh, and bone, and in an instant the jungle reeled him backward, vanishing into the thick foliage. His scream choked into silence. A second later, the wet, crunching sound of bones snapping echoed from the shadows. Another reaver slashed wildly at a mass of slithering roots, severing them in a spray of thick, black ichor. The plant twisted, releasing a piercing shriek that made even the most hardened corsairs flinch, before a serpentine vine wrapped around the attacker's throat and pulled his head clean from his shoulders. A shadow darted from above. From the canopy, a gargantuan reptilian beast plummeted onto a third corsair, claws piercing through his back, impaling him into the jungle floor. The creature, a chameleon skink, its skin shifting color in the dim light, hissed as it ripped open the elf's ribcage with its claws, spilling his insides onto the roots. The ambush was coordinated, calculated. This was no mere jungle hazard. The Lizardmen had never left. The prophecy of the Slann. Vaedrith snarled, whipping her cutlass in a deadly arc, severing one of the writhing jungle tendrils that lashed at her. Blood, thick, black, and steaming, splattered across her face. But she did not stop. "Fall back," she barked, slashing at the advancing skinks, their obsidian-tipped javelins already raised for another strike. The elves retreated into the ruined temple, shoving aside crumbling stonework as they sealed themselves within. Inside, the darkness was suffocating. The walls pulsed with unnatural green light, radiating from a massive stone mural that dominated the chamber. Vaedrith's eyes widened. It was a prophecy. Carved in ancient relief, the image depicted a great catastrophe. Figures cloaked in darkness stealing a massive hoard of warpstone from a fallen temple. Above them, the image of an enormous toad-like being loomed, its eyes burning with celestial fury. Below, lashing storms of energy, the march of reptilian warriors, and something else. A shrouded horror, something vast and formless, coiled in the depths below the temple. Lizardmen Velcor, her robes stained with the blood of the ritual sacrifices, stepped forward. She raised a slender, talon-like hand to the mural, tracing the symbols. Her lips moved silently as she deciphered the Slann glyphs. "They knew we would come," she murmured, her voice filled with genuine unease. Syleth spat onto the floor. "Superstition. They're dead." Lizardmen slowly turned to him, her face unreadable. "No, Syleth. They are waiting." A deep, rumbling tremor shook the temple floor. From the depths of the ruins, a sound like grinding stone echoed upwards, as though something had just stirred in the blackness below. Vaedrith clenched her jaw. The Warpstone hoard was close. But so was something else. And whatever it was, it had just woken up. Chapter 3. Blood in the Water. The Blackfang crawled upriver like a wounded beast, its blackened hull slicing through the murky waters of the Tlaloc's maw, a twisting, choking artery of jungle filth that reeked of rot and stagnant death. Fanged roots and grasping vines lined the edges of the riverbanks, their curling tendrils reaching out like skeletal fingers, eager to drag intruders beneath the surface. The air was thick with humidity, suffocating and heavy, filled with the ever-present hum of unseen insects. Something moved in the canopy, shadows shifting unnaturally. They were being watched. Vaedrith Nightbane stood on the prow of the ship, her expression impassive despite the tension gripping her crew. Her cutlass gleamed in the dim jungle light, its serrated edge still stained with the dark ichor of the things they had slaughtered in the ruins. Beneath her coat her pulse was steady, her breath measured. Only fools allowed fear to settle in their bones. Behind her, First Mate Saleth Vane clenched his jaw, his good eye scanning the tree line. His ruined left socket ached in the presence of warp taint. But the jungle was alive with more than just the lingering whispers of chaos. It hated them. He had fought men, dwarfs, even monsters, but this place, it did not want them here. A splash. A rippling disturbance in the water, just behind the ship's stern. Then another. The jungle fell into an eerie silence. No insects, no birds, just waiting. Saleth's hand went to the pistol at his hip. Then the river exploded. The ambush. From the trees, the skinks emerged, hundreds of them. Their scaled bodies shifted with the colors of the jungle, blending seamlessly into the foliage. Some carried obsidian-tipped javelins, others notched serrated arrows into primitive but deadly bows. A single keening whistle cut through the air, the signal to strike. The first javelin came from the right bank, soaring with unnatural precision, before punching through the throat of corsair Thaldris. The elf let out a wet, gurgling cough, clutching his pierced windpipe as blood flooded his lungs. He collapsed to the deck, spasming violently. Then, chaos erupted. A barrage of arrows rained down, the obsidian tips punching through armor, slicing through muscle and bone as if it were nothing. A corsair screamed as a javelin impaled his shoulder, the force of it throwing him overboard into the black water. A kroxigr burst from the undergrowth, its massive frame wreathed in shadow and steam. With inhuman strength, it hurled a boulder the size of a dark elf's torso. The stone smashed into the ship's starboard side, sending splinters and gore flying as two reavers were crushed instantly beneath the impact. Vaedrith reacted without hesitation, her cutlass flashing as she leapt onto the railing. A single gesture, a silent command, and her corsairs knew what had to be done. Kill them all! The counterattack. The corsairs retaliated, unleashing volley after volley of repeater crossbow fire into the dense foliage. The skinks shrieked as black-fletched bolts tore into them, puncturing scaled throats, shattering bone, and sending their small, agile bodies tumbling from the trees. Saleth drew his pistol, took aim and fired, the alchemical blast roaring like a dragon's breath as it punched through a skink's skull, sending a spray of brain and ichor across the tree trunks. He barely had time to reload before another reptilian shadow lunged from the water, its fangs bared. A razorum, its spined back bristling, snarled as it fired a hail of quills at the deck. One of the projectiles punched clean through a corsair's helmet, impaling his face in a shower of blood and shattered bone. His body twitched before he collapsed, his ruined skull still hissing as venom ate into his flesh. Vaedrith moved like a wraith, sidestepping an incoming javelin before launching herself off the railing. She landed with cat-like grace onto the riverbank, her blade already slicing through the first skink's throat before her boots had fully touched the ground. The creature let out a gargling hiss, its arterial spray coating the vines behind it. With unrelenting ferocity, she carved through another skink, severing its arm at the elbow before stabbing deep into its gut, twisting the blade until its innards spilled onto the ground in a steaming pile. A massive kroxigr turned its hulking bulk toward her, its primitive great club raised high. Too slow. Vaedrith darted under its swing, feeling the air quake as the weapon struck the earth, sending up a shockwave of dirt and splintered rock. She sprang up behind it, her cutlass biting deep into the beast's Achilles tendon. The kroxigr bellowed as its leg gave way, sending it crashing onto its knees. With a single fluid motion, Vaedrith climbed its back, straddling its thick neck. One precise slash, and the beast's throat split open, releasing a torrent of dark arterial blood that gushed down its chest like a waterfall. The hulking reptilian form collapsed, sending a thunderous tremor through the jungle. The aftermath. The remaining skinks retreated, vanishing into the jungle, their camouflaged bodies melting into the undergrowth as quickly as they had appeared. The corsairs were bloodied, their numbers reduced, but the battle was theirs. Vaedrith stood atop the fallen Kroxigor, her face splattered with blood, her chest heaving with exertion. The Blackfang's deck was a slaughterhouse, bodies strewn across the planks, their lifeblood leaking between the cracks of the ship into the river below. Salith staggered to her side, wiping blood from his brow, his expression dark. "This is madness," he growled, voice low enough so only she could hear. "Half the crew dead before we've even seen the Warpstone. You're leading us into the pit, Vaedrith." She turned to him, her eyes cold. "There is no turning back. We press on." Salith held her gaze, his jaw clenched. This wasn't a mere raid. This was something worse, something unnatural, and he was beginning to wonder if any of them would live to see Naggaroth again. Beneath the water. As the corsairs collected their dead and the Blackfang continued up the river, the murky depths below the ship remained undisturbed. But far beneath, in the blackness of the jungle's veins, something ancient stirred, something that had been watching them, waiting, and soon it would rise. Chapter 4. The Slave Raid. The Blackfang lay anchored in the shadow of a twisted mangrove, its blood-stained hull barely visible beneath the thick foliage. A low mist curled over the river's surface, hiding the ship like a lurking predator. On the deck, Captain Vaedrith Nightbane stood motionless, watching the skink village across the water. The jungle hummed with life, but here, where the reptilian creatures lived in crude stone dwellings, there was something wrong. The skinks moved frantically, their scaled bodies shimmering with the colors of unease. They had felt the weight of the slaughter upriver. They knew death was coming, and yet they did not flee. Vaedrith narrowed her eyes. Something binds them here. Behind her, Salith Vane grunted, adjusting the razor-edged gauntlets he wore over his wrists. "Good. They'll be easier to catch." A glacial breath stirred the humid air. Lizardmen stood further back, wrapped in a shroud of violet silk, her ashen face unreadable. She had spoken little since the ambush on the river, her eyes glossed with something deeper than exhaustion. "I do not like this," the sorceress murmured, her voice barely audible. Vaedrith flicked her gaze to her. "You never like anything." Lizath's fingers curled slightly, and for a moment the air tightened, as if unseen hands had grasped at throats. Then it was gone. She exhaled, long and slow. "The veil is thin here. Something lingers beneath this land." Vaedrith's smile was all daggers and malice. "Then let it watch." She turned back to her crew. "Kill the strong. Chain the weak. The raid begins." The first corsair struck like a shadow, his dual blades flashing as he severed a skink's throat before it could even scream. Dark-cloaked raiders burst from the trees, their crossbows hissing as bolts punched through scaled flesh, the skinks falling in silent agony. The village erupted into chaos. A Kroxigor lumbered from its stone pen, bellowing as it grabbed a corsair in one massive claw. With a single terrible motion it crushed his ribcage, splintering bone and spraying blood in a gruesome mist. Vaedrith lunged, her cutlass slicing deep into the creature's thick neck. The Kroxigor roared, its massive club swinging, but she was faster, twisting beneath the blow and driving her blade into its gut. She ripped sideways, spilling steaming entrails onto the village floor. It toppled, thrashing in its own blood and offal. Salith led the second wave, his razor gauntlets flashing as he tore through a skink's chest, the ribs peeling apart like wet parchment. He kicked another in the throat, sending it gurgling into the dirt. The village burned, the corsairs laughing as they cut down anything that resisted. The few survivors were bound in iron chains, their scaled bodies trembling. Vaedrith wiped her blade clean on a corpse and turned to her first mate. "How many?" Stalked kicked a severed head aside. 14. Vaedrith smiled. "Then we have enough for the ritual." The sorceress's warning. Back aboard the Blackfang, the air was thick with incense and death. The prisoners knelt in a circle, their wrists bound, their large yellow eyes flickering between terror and defiance. At the center of the dark altar, Lizardmen Velcor stood motionless, her pale fingers tracing runes into the blood-soaked wood. She had been silent since the raid, too silent. Vaedrith stepped forward. "Begin." Lizardmen turned her head slowly, her gaze unreadable. "Do you not feel it?" she whispered. The word sent a shiver through the nearest corsair. Vaedrith folded her arms. "Feel what?" Lizardmen's voice was barely above a whisper. "The dead." The corsairs exchanged glances. The skink prisoners stiffened. Their eyes, once filled with rage and hatred, were now consumed by something else. Something close to dread. Lizardmen took a slow step back, her thin fingers trembling slightly. "There is something ancient beneath this land, Vaedrith. Something that was never meant to wake." Vaedrith's lips curled into a sneer. "Spare me your riddles, witch." Lizardmen turned away, closing her blackened eyes. The wind outside the ship howled. Vaedrith raised her blade. The first skink was dragged forward, kicking and hissing. The cut was quick, the head rolled. The ship trembled. Vaedrith hesitated. Then she heard it. A whisper. It did not belong to the dying. It did not belong to the living. It belonged to something else entirely. Something beneath them. Something rising. Something that could not be slain by mortal hands. The undead rise. Far below the ship, deep beneath the jungle's surface, something shifted. The earth cracked. The mangled remains of ancient warriors, long buried beneath stone and time, twitched. They had been waiting, and the corsairs had called them back. From the blackness of the earth, the dead began to move, and they were coming. Chapter 5. The Temple of the Eclipse. The jungle swallowed them whole, thick vines curling like skeletal fingers around the marching column of corsairs. The Blackfang survivors moved through the undergrowth like shadowed wraiths, their blades drawn, their crossbows loaded. Overhead, the sky had darkened unnaturally, the canopy twisting into a mass of knotted branches, blotting out the moon and stars. But it was not night. A perpetual twilight hung over this place, a sickly half-light, unnatural and oppressive. The deeper they ventured, the more the jungle felt wrong. It was as though they had stepped into the gullet of some slumbering beast, their presence nothing more than an intrusion upon something ancient and hungry. Vaedrith Nightbane led the way, her grip firm on her serrated cutlass, her keen eyes fixed ahead. She could feel it, the pull of something unnatural, something just beyond sight. The Warpstone hoard lay within the ruins ahead, of that she had no doubt. But so did something else, something old, something that hated them. The pyramid rises. The jungle ended abruptly, the thick vegetation giving way to an immense clearing, and there, at its heart, rose the Temple of the Eclipse. The Slann pyramid was massive, its stone blackened with time and blood. Towering staircases led to a shattered apex, where glyphs flickered, dim and malignant. Massive serpentine carvings coiled around the structure, their eyes empty pits, their fangs bared in eternal menace. The temple loomed with an unnatural gravity, as though it breathed, as though it remembered. Stalked veins spat into the dirt. "I don't like this." Lizardmen Velcor, the sorceress, stood rigid, her pale face unreadable. The wind curled unnaturally around her, whispering with a voice not her own. This place was never meant to be touched. Vaedrith smirked. Then it's a good thing we're here to desecrate it." Without another word, she moved forward, her boots silent on the ancient stones. The murals of doom. The inner temple was a tomb. The walls were lined with massive murals, etched in obsidian relief, their edges glinting with a faint green glow, warpstone dust embedded into the very rock. They told a story, one of doom and warning. Vaedrith ran her fingers across the first carving, its depictions crude but eerily lifelike. A host of Druchii, their ships gleaming, sailed into the jungled rivers. The second carving showed their arrival, the corsairs storming the temple, weapons raised high, their laughter etched into eternity. The third mural, carnage. The elves' bodies were twisted, their flesh melted, their skulls split open, as if something had burrowed out from within. The final carving showed only darkness, a great toad-like figure, wreathed in fire and storm, watching from above as the temple devoured them whole. The room seemed to tighten, the air grew thick. Lizardmen's voice was a whisper. They were warned. The door to the inner sanctum. Vaedrith shook off the unease and pressed onward. At the end of the chamber, an enormous stone door loomed, carved with the image of a Slann's unblinking eye. Salith approached cautiously. "Traps?" Vaedrith smiled. "Of course." She turned to the crew. "Reavers, forward, earn your plunder." A handful of corsairs moved in, their hands running over the stone, testing for hidden pressure plates. One of them, Drakir, pressed against the central glyph. The door shuddered, releasing a low groan as ancient gears grinded to life. Then the floor dropped out beneath him. Drakir barely had time to scream before iron spikes shot upward, impaling him through the back and gut. Blood spattered the walls, the sickening crunch of bone and cartilage echoing through the chamber. His body twitched once, then went limp, his intestines coiling like spilled rope down the spikes. Salith exhaled through his nose. That could have been worse. The door, however, was open. Vaedrith stepped past the ruined corpse, her boots slick with blood, and entered the inner sanctum. The gas of the damned. The chamber beyond was black as pitch, the air choked with something foul. The warpstone glow intensified, seeping from the walls, pulsing in veins of unnatural green. At the center, a massive stone altar loomed, covered in Slann glyphs, and atop it sat a cache of pure, raw warpstone. The crew stood in awe. The power radiating from the hoard was suffocating, its mere presence buzzing in their skulls, filling them with visions of grandeur and madness. Then the air shifted. A low hiss. A hidden mechanism ground to life, unseen gears turning in the darkness. The walls exhaled. A cloud of thick green gas billowed from the cracks in the stone, rushing through the chamber in an unstoppable wave. Corsairs gasped, clutching their throats as the tainted mist burned its way into their lungs. Vaedrith staggered back, covering her face with her cloak, but she could already hear the screams, not from pain, but from something worse. The weak-willed fell first. One corsair, John, let out a shuddering laugh, his eyes rolling back as his veins blackened beneath his skin. He convulsed, then tore his own face open with his nails, his flesh melting away in steaming chunks. Another fell to his knees, weeping blood before turning on his own kin, his blade carving into the nearest corsair's gut, spilling steaming entrails onto the altar. The warpstone's influence was warping them. Salith grabbed Vaedrith by the shoulder, his own skin pale, but his will unbroken. "We need to get out, now." Vaedrith snarled, but she knew he was right. Lizardmen, her eyes black as the void, spoke one final warning. "It is not just gas." The room trembled. From the darkness, something shifted. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for them. And now it was awake. Chapter 6. The Awakening of Zoltar. The inner sanctum trembled. The sickly green mist still clung to the air, twisting like whispering tendrils around the corsairs. The warp taint had already claimed the weakest minds, turning some into frothing, gibbering wretches, their flesh bubbling as they clawed at their own faces. Others had been driven to madness, turning blades on their own kin, guttural howls filling the chamber as their blood painted the temple walls. But none of it mattered. Something else had woken her, something that should have never stirred again. A sound filled the air, deeper than any battle horn, older than any storm, a grinding, resonant growl, not of an animal, but of stone shifting against stone. It did not echo, it simply was, as if the temple itself had drawn its first breath in eons. Vaedrith stilled, her cutlass raised. The remaining corsairs fell silent, their bloodied weapons clenched tight. The gas began to dissipate, revealing the monolithic figure at the heart of the chamber. It stood in the dark, still as a statue, its massive form carved from black jade and cerulean scales. Asurus Eternity Warden, the greatest warriors of the Lizardmen, eternal sentinels of the Slann, deathless and unbreakable. Exaltalk had awoken. His heavy-lidded eyes flickered with an inner fire, the glow of something beyond mortal comprehension. His chest, broad as a fortress wall, rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. His scaled arms, thick as an ogre's waist, flexed as he adjusted his gold-forged halberd, a massive polearm inscribed with glowing glyphs of the Old Ones. The magic of the first spawn surged through his veins, his body imbued with celestial wrath, his purpose absolute. There was no hesitation, no words, only judgment. The first strike. Exaltalk moved. One moment he was still, a monolith of war, ancient and unyielding. The next, he was upon them, the air shattering with the force of his charge. His halberd flashed, arcane glyphs igniting, and a corsair's body split in two, cleaved from shoulder to hip. A spray of gore burst across the chamber walls as the two halves of the elf slapped wetly onto the temple floor, his guts steaming in the cold air. Another corsair raised his crossbow, panic in his eyes. The bolt fired true, punching into Xoltalk's chest, but the guardian did not falter. With a snarl, Exaltalk swung the butt of his halberd, the sheer impact caving the elf's skull inward. The body was flung across the chamber, smashing into the far wall with a sickening crunch, the remains sliding down in a broken heap. Vaedrith barely had time to react before the beast was upon her. She rolled aside, narrowly dodging a downward strike that split the stone floor apart, cracks webbing outward as green light seeped from the temple itself. "Fight, damn you!" she roared. The battle for survival. The corsairs unleashed hell, firing their repeater crossbows in a black hail of steel-tipped death. The bolts struck, biting into Xoltalk's hide, but he did not slow. The Eternity Warden lunged, swinging his halberd in an arc of ruin. One corsair leapt back just in time, but the one behind him was not so lucky. The blade caught him at the ribs, and in one fluid motion he was ripped in half, his upper body flung across the chamber, his legs left standing for a single, horrible second before they collapsed in a heap. Salith darted forward, his razor gauntlets flashing. He sidestepped another swing, slashing at the Sour's leg, cutting deep into muscle and sinew. But Exaltalk barely noticed. Instead, the Guardian's tail whipped out, a blur of motion. The impact was catastrophic. Salith was hurled across the chamber, his body slamming into a pillar, his ribs snapping like dry twigs. Vaedrith lunged, her cutlass flashing. She struck low, aiming for the beast's throat. Exaltalk caught the blade mid-strike. His grip was like iron, the strength behind it inhuman. The ancient guardian twisted and the blade snapped, the pieces of Vaedrith's once feared cutlass clattering onto the blood-soaked floor. For the first time in years, Vaedrith felt something close to fear. Exaltook raised his halberd for the killing blow, and then the warpstone pulsed. The corruption unleashed. The temple floor split open, releasing a wave of sickly green energy. The walls howled, the mural glyphs writhing as the cursed relics of chaos finally awoke. Exaltook froze, his eyes narrowing. He recognized this magic, the taint of the great enemy, the corruption of the Old One's vision. For a moment he hesitated. It was all the time Vaedrith needed. She drove a dagger into his exposed side, twisting deep, slicing through enchanted flesh. Exaltook roared, not in pain, but in pure, unbridled wrath. He threw her aside, sending her skidding across the temple floor. But the battle had changed. The warp-tainted gas had taken root in the weak-willed corsairs, their bodies contorting, their flesh warping, eyes bulging with unnatural hunger. One of them, once a loyal corsair, screeched in a voice that was not his own, before launching himself at his kin, his jaws distending, his teeth sinking into an elf's throat, ripping it open in a gushing torrent of blood. Exaltook saw it. He knew what had to be done. The Guardian turned from the elves, for now they were lesser threats. The true corruption had begun to spread, and that could not be allowed. With one final glance at Vaedrith, he stepped back into the darkness, his form vanishing into the temple's maze of corridors. The Eternity Warden had retreated, but he had not fled. He would return, and next time the elves would not escape into the jungle. Vaedrith coughed, blood dripping from her lips, her vision swimming. Salith, limping, gripped her arm, his face a mask of pain and fury. "We have to go, now." She did not argue. The survivors fled, leaving the screaming, warped remnants of their once proud crew writhing in the temple's cursed halls. The jungle awaited them, and so did the vengeance of Zoltok. Chapter 7. The Power of Greed. The jungle swallowed them whole. Thick vines, slick with moisture and decay, grasped at the corsairs as they staggered away from the cursed temple. The few that remained of the Blackfang's crew were bloodied, battered and broken, their once proud cloaks torn and soaked in filth. The echoes of their slaughtered comrades still rang in their ears, the screams of those twisted by the warp-tainted gas, forever burned into their memories. And yet, Vaedrith Nightbane marched on. She clutched the warpstone fragment in her gloved fist, its sickly green glow pulsing like a heartbeat. The others had seen it, had felt its power, but she had claimed it. It was hers. Behind her, the muttering of the survivors grew louder. Fear, suspicion, paranoia. The jungle was not silent. It whispered in warp-tainted tongues, the trees hissing with unseen voices, the very air pressing against their minds. And in the dark, Solid Vane watched his captain closely. He had been loyal, always loyal. But now, as he saw the way Vaedrith's eyes gleamed unnaturally in the darkness, the way she clutched that cursed stone as if it were her lifeblood, he knew what had to be done. She was losing herself, and if he did not stop her, they would all be lost with her. Madness takes root. They stumbled into a clearing where the remnants of their supplies and rations had been left before the temple raid. The fire pit smoldered, its embers pulsing like dying stars. The survivors collapsed, gasping, coughing, some clutching wounds, others merely staring blankly at the sky, their minds broken by what they had witnessed. "Water," one of the corsairs, Valtherus, rasped. He crawled toward a water skin, his hand trembling. Before he could take it, another elf, Dariel, his eyes wide and sunken, lunged at him, dagger in hand. "The stone," he shrieked. "It whispers to me. It showed me. You're not worthy." The blade plunged into Valtherus's throat, a wet, sickening puncture, followed by gurgling agony. He jerked once, clutching at his own neck as blood sprayed onto the dirt, and then collapsed, twitching, convulsing, before going still. Dariel stood over him, panting, shaking. Then he began to laugh. It was a horrible sound, full of wild glee and hysteria. Vaedrith stepped forward and cut him down without hesitation. Her cutlass flashed, and Dariel's head rolled from his shoulders, hitting the ground with a dull, wet thud. His body remained standing for a moment, swaying, before it collapsed atop Valtheris's corpse. The others stared. Vaedrith sheathed her blood-stained blade and turned to the survivors, her face impassive. "This is what awaits those who falter," she said. "Control yourselves. Or I'll do it for you." She expected obedience. What she saw instead was doubt. And in Solith's eyes, she saw something else entirely. The mutiny begins. Solith waited until nightfall. He moved between the survivors, whispering to those who would listen. "She's leading us to ruin. She won't share the Warpstone. She doesn't care if we die, as long as she gets her prize." Some listened. Some were too broken to resist. Others had already felt the taint of the Warpstone and saw the world through glowing, fevered eyes. But enough agreed. Vaedrith had to be removed. Betrayal in the dark. Vaedrith sat near the dying fire, the Warpstone pulsing in her hand. She could hear it now, truly hear it. It was not just a rock, it was alive, whispering in a voice as old as the stars, promising her glory, power, and vengeance against all who stood in her way. Her mind felt stretched, like it was being pulled between worlds, between past and future, between mortal and something greater. Then she heard it, the sound of blades sliding from their sheaths. She smirked. "At least you had the courtesy to wait until nightfall, Saleh." The first mate stepped forward, flanked by 5 others. Their eyes were cold, their hands steady on their weapons. "You've lost control, Vaedrith." His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "You're not the captain anymore." Vaedrith rose slowly, her eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Is that so?" Then she moved. Her dagger was out before Solith could react, slicing toward his throat. "Go." His gauntlet caught the blade, twisting her wrist hard. She hissed, yanking back just in time to dodge the slash of a curved sword from another corsair. The camp erupted into violence. Vaedrith rolled beneath a sweeping strike, her cutlass flashing in the firelight. She drove it through a corsair's ribs, twisted and ripped it free, sending blood and viscera splattering across the dirt. Another came at her with a pair of daggers, moving fast, but she was faster. She grabbed his wrist, snapped it, and drove her knee into his gut, sending him crashing to the ground, gasping and coughing blood. Solith attacked next. His razor gauntlet slashed through the air, narrowly missing her throat. She ducked, countering with a low sweep, but he jumped back, too quick, too skilled. For a moment they locked eyes. 2 predators. 2 killers. Then a scream tore through the clearing. The jungle awakens. The survivors froze. Something moved in the darkness. A shape. Tall. Massive. Unstoppable. A glowing blue eye flickered to life. Zoltak had found them. And this time he was not alone. From the tree line, dozens of shadows shifted, Seraphon warriors, their gold-forged weapons gleaming, their eyes cold and merciless. Solith cursed. "We fight later. If we don't run now, we die here." For once, Vaedrith agreed. They turned and ran, fleeing into the jungle as the Lizardmen charged. Behind them, the camp erupted into slaughter, the last remnants of the Blackfang's crew screaming as they were cut down, their blood soaking into the cursed earth of Lustria. Vaedrith clutched the Warpstone and ran. This was not over. Not yet. But she would make them all pay. Every last one. Chapter 8. The jungle hungers. The jungle watched them. It was no longer a mere collection of trees, vines, and rot. It was alive, and it was hungry. The deeper the remnants of Vaedrith Nightbane's crew fled into Lustria's choking heart, the more unnatural the land became. The trees twisted, their bark resembling gaping mouths and clutching fingers. Roots pulsed as though something beneath the soil was breathing. The air itself felt thicker, pressing against their skin like a living thing, whispering in voices just beyond hearing. They had fled from the Seraphon, from Joltak's wrath, but they had not escaped. Lustria was a labyrinth of nightmares, and it did not forgive trespassers. The first signs of madness. They moved in silence, their numbers dwindled, their bodies filthy and broken. Vaedrith Nightbane walked at the rear, his hand always on his blade, watching. He had abandoned the mutiny for now. There was no point in overthrowing Vaedrith when they were all doomed anyway. The crew was fractured, barely clinging to reason. The jungle wanted them dead. And something else was at work. The first sign was Corsair Yuller. He had been whispering to himself for hours, staring too long at the vines, flinching at things only he could see. Then, without a word, he stepped off the path, walking into the thick undergrowth. "Ihar!" Vaedrith snapped, turning just as the vines closed behind him, swallowing him whole. A high-pitched scream followed. Wet, gurgling, short. They never saw him again. The spawn of chaos. By nightfall, the cursed jungle revealed its true face. The creatures came first. One of the corsairs, Lizardmen, was keeping watch when she saw movement in the darkness. Something crawled toward the camp. Not an animal, not a lizardman, but something born from madness. It had once been a man, a human, or something like one. But it was twisted, its limbs too long, its bones shifting beneath its flesh as though they were melting and reforming with every movement. Its mouth yawned open, a gaping, toothless maw that stretched down its throat. Veins pulsed across its arms, thick and black with corruption. And its eyes were hollow pits, weeping black ichor. It lurched forward, its distended arms reaching, whispering in a voice that was not its own. "You are seen." Lizardmen tried to scream, but the thing moved faster than it should have, its jaw distending as it lunged. The others woke to her screams, but by the time they reached her, she was gone. Her body pulled into the roots, her flesh bubbling where the creature had touched her. Then the other things came. Some slithered, their flesh warping with each breath. Others scuttled, their bone-exposed fingers twitching as they chanted nonsense in a language no mortal had ever spoken. The corsairs fought back, but the jungle itself was against them. One of the things lunged at Vaedrith, its fingers like hooked talons. He caught its wrist, twisted, the bones snapped like dry twigs. Then he drove his dagger into its throat, slicing deep. Black ichor sprayed, steaming where it hit the ground. The creature wheezed, its body convulsing violently, before something else erupted from its mouth, a smaller, writhing mass of bone and flesh, screeching as it tried to burrow into Vaedrith's face. He ripped it free, slamming it to the ground, then crushed it beneath his boot. All around them, the jungle howled. The corruption spreads. Vaedrith led them deeper, cutting down anything in their path. But she could feel it too. The Warpstone was calling to her, its power sinking into her veins. And she was not the only one affected. One of the corsairs, Vaedrith, had been acting strangely since the temple. Her skin had darkened, veins bulging, her nails lengthening into something unnatural. That night, they found her standing over a corsair's body, her mouth stained with blood, her fingers digging into the corpse's stomach. She looked up, her eyes now pitch black, and smiled. "The gift of the gods is upon us," she whispered. Vaedrith beheaded her where she stood. Lizardmen's warning. As they fled, the sorceress Lizardth Velcor lagged behind, her robes billowing, her eyes flickering with unreadable power. She did not fight. She did not run. She only watched. When the last of the mutated things were slain, she turned to Vaedrith, her voice cold and distant. "The jungle is not doing this." Vaedrith's breath was heavy, her blade dripping with blackened blood. Then what is? Lizard's fingers traced a rune in the air, and for a brief moment the fog of the jungle parted. They saw it. The sky above them was wrong, the stars twisted, the constellations shifting. The air shimmered as though it were not entirely real. Lizard's voice was grim. The warp is bleeding through. The laws of nature are collapsing. Someone has broken the veil. Vaedrith clenched her fist around the Warpstone fragment, feeling its sickening pulse against her palm. Lizard's gaze locked onto it. That thing will lead you to ruin, Vaedrith. Even now it's changing you. Vaedrith smiled coldly. Then let it. The jungle watches. As they moved on, the jungle whispered. It was no longer just Lustria. It was something older, something deeply aware of them. And it was hungry. Their path led toward a rising hill where the ruins of another temple loomed in the distance. They had no idea what awaited them there. But the jungle knew. And it was waiting. Chapter 9. Betrayal in the Ruins. The final temple rose from the jungle's suffocating grip, its silhouette carved against the unnatural twilight. A monolith of blackened stone, etched with winding serpentine glyphs, it pulsed faintly with an eerie green glow. Warp taint clung to its surface, the air around it heavy, humid, and wrong. The survivors of the Blackfang stood before it, bloodied, exhausted, and fraying at the edges. Madness had taken root in many of them. The jungle had hollowed them out, leaving only greed, hunger, and fear. And at their head, Vaedrith Nightbane stood resolute, the Warpstone shard clenched in her fist, its sickly light reflected in her cold, calculating eyes. Behind her, Stalked Vane watched. He had waited, plotted, weighed the risks. Now, at the foot of the final prize, he made his decision. This was where it ended. The breaking point. Are we just going to follow her blindly? Stalked's voice cut through the oppressive silence, his words like a dagger slipping between ribs. Vaedrith turned slowly, the faintest smirk curling her lips. She had expected this. Say what you mean, first mate. Stalked stepped forward, his hand resting on his blade, his scarred face unreadable. I mean you're leading us to our deaths. His voice was calm, measured, but beneath it simmered something raw. Look around, Captain. Look at what's left of us. The remaining corsairs shifted uneasily, glancing between their leader and their would-be usurper. They had lost too much. The mutants, the jungle, the Seraphon, it had whittled them down to a handful of broken survivors. And now Vaedrith wanted them to go further. Stalked's voice hardened. The jungle is killing us. That temple, it'll finish the job. Vaedrith's grip on the Warpstone tightened, the pulsing light reflecting in her sharpened gaze. And what would you have us do, Stalked? She asked, mocking amusement dripping from her voice. Turn back? Scuttle into the darkness like scared little rats? Stalked's jaw tensed. I say we take what we have and leave. He gestured to the Warpstone in her grip, his tone edged with venom. You hold the fragment. That's more than enough wealth to buy a fleet of ships back home. Vaedrith let out a soft, mirthless chuckle. You're a fool, Stalked. Her expression darkened, and for the first time, the mutiny became real. Stalked saw it. And he acted. The first cut. Stalked moved like a striking serpent, his razor gauntlets flashing in the temple's unholy glow. Vaedrith barely dodged the first strike, twisting just enough to avoid having her throat slit open. The corsairs erupted into chaos. Some rushed to their captain's defense, others, their loyalties already wavering, turned on their own kin. Steel clashed on steel, and Druchii blood spilled across the temple steps. The battle for leadership. Vaedrith's cutlass flicked out, catching Stalked's forearm, the blade biting deep into his scarred flesh. He grunted, staggering back, but lashed out in turn. His gauntlets raked across her chest, slicing through fabric and skin, sending a spray of dark blood into the dirt. Vaedrith hissed, pain flaring through her body, but she did not falter. She grinned instead. "You should have struck deeper, first mate." She drove forward, her blade a blur, cutting through the air with practiced lethality. Stalked barely blocked the next strike, stumbling as she pressed him back, step by step toward the edge of the ruin. The corsairs' slaughter. All around them, dark elf fought dark elf. A corsair named Naggaroth drove his dagger into a fellow crewman's eye, the sickening pop of punctured flesh drowned by the carnage around them. Another corsair was pinned to the ground, his own blade driven through his mouth, the steel punching out the back of his skull. A pair of reavers, locked in deadly combat, rolled down the temple steps, their bodies twisting, their blades still sinking into each other as they hit the ground below. The jungle devoured their corpses without hesitation. Blood painted the ancient stones, their greed and betrayal feeding the land. And the temple watched it all. The escape of the skink priest. Amidst the carnage, something small and quick moved unseen. The skink priest, the one they had captured and bound days before, had been forgotten in the madness of their own destruction. His bindings loosened, his small hands worked free. With a single silent motion, he vanished into the jungle, his scales blending with the foliage, his feet light as mist on the river. He did not run in fear. He ran with purpose. The gods had seen enough. It was time for the wrath of the Old Ones to fall upon these invaders. The final blow. Stalked saw his opening. Vaedrith had faltered for half a breath, and that was all he needed. He lunged, his gauntlets aimed for her heart. But she had been waiting. She stepped aside, her cutlass flashing, and in a single fluid motion, she carved a line across his gut. Stalked gasped, his hands flying to his stomach, where his own insides were now spilling into his grip. He fell to his knees, his gaze full of disbelief. Vaedrith leaned down, her voice soft as silk. "You never had the strength to finish the kill." And with that, she drove her dagger into his throat, twisting the blade until she felt the final shudder of life leave his body. She let him fall forward, his corpse joining the rest of the fallen. The mutiny was over. But the real war had just begun. The jungle listened. As the final screams faded, the remaining corsairs looked around. They had won, but at what cost? The crew was a fraction of what it had been. And far, far away, the skink priest was already gathering the Seraphon. The final battle was coming. And this time, there would be no survivors. Chapter 10. The Guardian's Curse. The final chamber loomed ahead, its massive stone doors cracked ajar, as if something had forced them open from within. The surviving corsairs stood at the threshold, bloodied, breathless, and broken, their bodies slick with sweat and gore from the slaughter at the ruins above. Behind them the temple whispered, a deep, resonant pulse as though it were alive, breathing in the stagnant air. Beyond the threshold, the promise of glory and wealth awaited. The Warpstone hoard. Vaedrith Nightbane did not hesitate. She stepped forward, her boots echoing against the black stone floor, her cutlass slick with the blood of traitors. The others followed, but in their eyes was more than just greed now. There was fear, and rightly so. The vault of the Old Ones. The chamber stretched far beyond sight, its vaulted ceiling lost to the shadows above. Pillars of serpentine stone rose from the damp floor, their surfaces etched with winding hieroglyphs, flickering faintly with an unnatural luminescence. At the heart of the chamber lay the prize. A massive pit, its depths illuminated by the sickly green glow of raw warpstone. It was more than any of them had ever seen, hundreds of jagged shards, their surfaces pulsing like living things, veins of green fire twisting through the cracks of the stone. The air around it rippled, distorting like heat waves on a corpse-littered battlefield. The warp was thick here. It sang to them. It called their names. Corsairs who had hesitated before stepped forward now, their fingers twitching, their eyes wide and hungry. Some laughed, others whispered to themselves, already lost to the whispers of the immaterial realm. Vaedrith reached the edge of the pit. She could feel it in her bones, in the very core of her being. This was power beyond reckoning. This was everything. But then Lysith Velcor spoke. Her voice was flat, hollow, filled with something close to dread. This is not just a vault. Vaedrith turned. The sorceress stood stiffly, her fingers trembling, her blackened lips parting as she traced something unseen in the air. The runes on the walls, they were not warnings. They were bindings. A prison. The chamber shook. The spirit stirs. The walls groaned as the ancient glyphs flared to life, their golden light fighting against the unholy glow of the Warpstone. A deep, resonant hum filled the chamber, like the dying breath of a god. Then, from the darkness, it rose. A form vast and formless, a shimmering mirage of flesh and magic, shifting between corporeal and ethereal, its eyes burning with celestial fury. A Slann priest, its physical body long decayed, but its will still bound to this cursed place. Its voice was not spoken, but it pierced their skulls like a blade of pure willpower, each word heavy with the weight of eternity. You have come seeking power, as others before you. The corsairs staggered, clutching their heads as the force of the Slann's mind crushed down upon them, like a mountain pressing into their very souls. Vaedrith gritted her teeth, trying to fight back the sensation of her mind unraveling. The Slann's glowing form drifted over the Warpstone, its eyes full of wrath. But power has a price. The chamber screamed. The curse is laid. The air turned to fire. Vaedrith felt it first, a searing pain beneath her flesh, like claws raking through her veins, like her very soul was being rewritten. Then the others began to wail. Their flesh blackened, ancient glyphs searing into their skin, crawling like parasites, burning with a light older than time itself. Their minds twisted, fragments of memories not their own forcing their way in, visions of dead empires, of star-born gods, of the endless cycle of war and ruin. The Slann's voice did not falter. You are bound to this place now. The ground split beneath them, tendrils of warp-tainted mist rising like phantoms, wrapping around their throats, their wrists, their very bones. One of the corsairs, Cadrus, let out a horrified shriek, drawing his dagger and plunging it into his own heart, trying to escape whatever horror had latched onto him. But the curse did not care. His body twitched, convulsed, then rose again. His eyes were hollow, his veins black with taint. He stood, trembling, but he did not breathe. The Slann's voice was final. Your fates are sealed. This temple is your tomb. The desperate escape. Vaedrith refused to accept it. She staggered to her feet, ignoring the pain clawing through her body, forcing her lungs to draw breath, her legs to move. She turned to the others. Some still screamed. Others had collapsed in silent horror, unable to move. Lizardmen met her gaze. We need to go. Now! Vaedrith snarled, dragging one of the fallen corsairs to his feet. Move, you worthless dogs. And then the Slann raised its hand. The temple began to collapse. The pillars cracked, raining debris. The walls twisted, the very stone reshaping itself, sealing the exits, trapping them inside. A race against time. Vaedrith ran, her sword flashing as she cut down the mindless husks of her former crew. The warp-mad and cursed, now shambling forward, eyes empty, their lips whispering prayers to gods long dead. Zalith remaining loyalists fought beside her, hacking, slashing, their own bodies burning with the Slann's sigils, but refusing to die just yet. One corsair was crushed beneath falling rubble, his screams cut short as the temple devoured him. Another was seized by spectral hands, his body ripped in half, his guts spilling across the floor like a sacrifice upon an altar. The exit was closing. Vaedrith threw herself forward, diving through the last gap in the stone, feeling the weight of the temple slam shut behind her. The survivors tumbled into the jungle, and the temple behind them was silent once more. But in their souls, they felt it still. The curse had bound them. They would never truly escape. The jungle knows. The survivors lay, panting, clutching their burning flesh, feeling the Slann's sigil still pulsing beneath their skin. Vaedrith rose last, her breath slow, measured, her eyes full of fury. They had escaped the temple, but not their fate. The jungle whispered to them. The hunt was not over, and something far worse than death was coming. Chapter 11. The Wrath of the Lizardmen. The Drums of Vengeance. The jungle had been silent for too long. The corsairs had barely escaped the collapsing temple, their bodies branded with the Slann's curse, their minds fractured by the horrors they had unleashed. And yet Vaedrith Nightbane led them forward, her cutlass gleaming in the sickly light of dawn, her grip unyielding around the Warpstone shard pulsing in her palm. They moved with urgency, hacking through thick undergrowth, their bodies slick with sweat and blood. Some stumbled under the weight of their loot, bags filled with Warpstone, their backs hunched as they dragged their cursed prize through the depths of Lustria. Then the drums began. A deep, resonant pounding, shaking the air, vibrating through the trees. Thum, thum, thum. The ground trembled, leaves raining down from the canopy above, as the beating rhythm of war grew louder. Vaedrith's gut twisted. She knew what it meant. The Seraphon had come, the hunters and the prey. A single piercing screech cut through the trees, the cry of a skink priest, high and filled with celestial fury. And then the jungle erupted. From the shadowed depths they came, Cold One cavalry, their scaled beasts snarling, eyes gleaming with feral bloodlust. Skink cohorts rushed forward, javelins and bows raised, their weapons gleaming with deadly venom. And behind them, the monsters loomed. Croxigors, the behemoth warriors of the Seraphon, their massive frames lumbering through the jungle, crushing trees beneath their clawed feet, their mighty clubs carved from enchanted stone, their glistening scales slick with war paint and divine wrath. At their head, mounted on a Cold One draped in golden sigils, was the skink priest they had let escape. Its eyes locked onto Vaedrith, its clawed hand raised, and with a single gesture it commanded the slaughter to begin. The chase begins. Run. Vaedrith's command snapped the corsairs into motion. They tore through the jungle, vaulting over roots and tangled vines, stumbling under the weight of the Warpstone they refused to abandon. The Lizardmen gave no quarter. The first volley of javelins came like a storm, whistling through the air, their obsidian tips punching through flesh and armor alike. One corsair, Sereth, took a javelin through the spine, his body jerking violently before he crumpled into the mud, his limbs twitching in death spasms. Another was skewered through the throat, his gurgled screams lost as his blood sprayed across the foliage. The skinks were fast, relentless, but the Cold One riders were worse. The first Cold One cavalryman crashed into their rear guard, its fangs latching onto a corsair's shoulder, ripping him from his feet, his body twisting as it was torn in two. Vaedrith vaulted over a fallen log, her cutlass flashing, her mind racing. They were being herded, driven toward something worse. But she refused to die here. "To the ruins! We make our stand at the ruins!" Rita's death. Not all listened. Some corsairs, blinded by their own greed, refused to abandon the hoard. One, Kaeldis, stopped, panting, shaking, trying to lift a Warpstone chunk the size of his own torso. His hands bled from where the taint had already begun corrupting his flesh, but he was laughing, weeping, dragging the stone behind him. "It's mine. I won't leave it," The gods see me! They see me! He never saw the Kroxigor coming. The beast's massive club descended, splitting Kaeldus in half, the impact sending bone shards and viscera spraying across the trees. His lungs still twitched in the pile of gore as the monstrosity bellowed, its eyes turning to the next corsair too slow to flee. Vaedrith didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The ruins of the damned. The survivors broke through the trees, bursting into an ancient ruin overgrown with vines and decay. Stone pillars jutted from the ground like broken fangs, and at the center of the ruins lay a dried-up sacrificial altar, its surface still black with the stains of old offerings. It would have to do. Vaedrith spun, her breath ragged, her hand clutching her blade. Make your stand. No one dies with empty hands. The corsairs rallied, their crossbows raised, bolts loosed in a black storm of steel. The first skinks fell, their tiny bodies perforated, blood dripping from their slitted throats. One cold one rider was thrown from his mount, his chest punctured by 6 bolts, his lifeless body tumbling into the undergrowth. But it was not enough. The Kroxigors crashed into the ruins, their massive weapons swinging, shattering stone, pulverizing bodies into wet chunks. One corsair, Vrayles, was caught mid-swing. The Kroxigor's hammer connected, and his entire torso imploded, ribs cracking outward, his spine snapping like dry wood. Another was snatched by a cold one, its razor teeth sinking into his stomach before whipping its head back, ripping out his intestines in one gory motion. The ruins were painted in Druchii blood. And then the skink priest arrived. It raised its staff and the jungle shook with celestial power. A storm of emerald lightning crackled into existence, striking down from the heavens, incinerating 3 corsairs where they stood, their screams lost in the deafening roar of magic. Vaedrith snarled, gripping the Warpstone shard tighter. She had to think. She had to act. Or she would die here. The final gambit? The battle was lost. They were outnumbered, outmatched, outmaneuvered. But Vaedrith had one thing left, the curse. She felt it burning inside her, the Slann's sigils seared into her soul, the Warpstone's taint twisting her blood. She turned to Lizardmen Velcor, who had survived the slaughter, her eyes knowing, furious, and resigned. Do it, Vaedrith commanded. Lyseth's expression darkened. You don't understand what you're asking. Vaedrith stepped closer, her voice a whisper. I understand perfectly. Lyseth's lips curled, her hands rising, dark energy crackling at her fingertips, and the jungle shuddered. Something was coming. Something far worse than the Lizardmen. Chapter 12. The Tides of Chaos. The Shore of Damnation. The jungle spat them out onto the black sands of the river's edge, where the Blackfang loomed in the distance, its dark sails rippling, its hull slick with rot and blood, waiting like a hungry beast to ferry them back to the nightmare of Naggaroth. But the corsairs had no time for relief. Behind them, the jungle howled with pursuit, the war drums of the Seraphon pounding like the heartbeat of a vengeful god. The skink priest's voice echoed through the trees, weaving celestial curses into the air, commanding his scaled warriors to slaughter the defilers. Vaedrith ran, her boots kicking up sand and blood, the Warpstone shard pulsing hot against her palm. She could feel it warping the world around her, twisting the very fabric of existence with each heartbeat. Then she heard it, a wet, guttural scream. She spun around and saw hell itself. Chaos takes its toll. Not all of them had made it to the shore sane. Some corsairs, those too weak, too tainted, too desperate to resist, had begun to change. Their bodies twisted under the Warpstone's relentless hunger, bones snapping, reshaping, flesh bubbling like boiling wax, features melting into unholy configuration. One, Darak, had fallen to his knees, his mouth stretching impossibly wide, his jaw unhinging as rows of teeth burst forth where his tongue had once been. He let out a wet, choked sob before his spine ruptured, sprouting barbed tendrils, his fingers fusing into claws. Another Maleth let out a shriek of agony as her skin hardened into cracked chitin, her eyes sinking into empty pits, her body convulsing as her legs fused into a writhing mass of serpentine flesh. The warp had claimed them, and they were no longer Druki. They were things. Vaedrith snarled. Kill them! Some hesitated. These had been their comrades, their brothers and sisters. But not anymore. The chaos-spawned abominations lunged, and the battle began. The butchery begins. Saleth was the first to react, still clutching his bloodied cutlass, despite his own cursed flesh burning beneath his armor. He twisted aside as Darak's newly formed claws slashed toward him, the air whistling as the bladed talons tore through empty space. Saleth countered, his cutlass flashing in a vicious arc, slicing through the mutant's elongated throat, severing the mass of writhing tendrils that had once been a tongue. Darak staggered, clawing at his own gaping, blood-spewing wound, but he did not fall. Instead, he grew. His arms doubled in length, his body swelling, his spine extending until his head hung limp upon his chest, twitching, laughing, a voice not his own whispering in 100 alien tongues. I see you. I see you. Saleth cursed. Then he drove his blade through its skull and ended its madness. Across the shore, the battle raged. A mutated corsair lunged at Lysaeth, its flesh shifting between forms, eyes blinking in and out of existence across its warped face. The sorceress did not hesitate. She raised a single hand, muttering words in a language that should not be spoken, and the thing exploded from within, its body twisting into a blackened husk, its screams swallowed by the void. Vaedrith carved a path through the transformed, her cutlass sinking deep into corrupted flesh, her dagger punching into twisting hearts, gore painting the black sand in arcs of crimson and bile. She had lost too much. She would not die here. Not like them. The Seraphon's arrival. But as the last of the warp-mad corsairs fell, a new horror emerged. The river exploded, sending waves crashing onto the shore, as the Cold One cavalry burst from the waters, their scaled mounts shrieking, their riders raising golden spears that crackled with divine energy. The Kroxigors followed, their massive frames rising from the depths, bellowing in rage, their weapons raised high. And at their head the skink priest, standing upon the massive back of an armored carnosaur, its yellow eyes burning with celestial fury. The jungle itself seemed to howl, as if Lustria itself had come to erase the invaders from its lands. This was the endgame, the last stand. The corsairs had no formation, no tactics left, only desperation. They met the charge head-on. Saleth ducked beneath the swing of a Kroxigor's club, rolling forward, his cutlass slashing through the beast's thick ankle, severing its tendons. The creature stumbled, roaring in agony, before another corsair leapt onto its back, driving a dagger into its skull until blackened ichor gushed from its eye sockets. Vaedrith lunged forward, sidestepping a Cold One's snapping jaws, before thrusting her blade up into its rider's ribs, punching through golden armor, tearing through flesh. The skink gasped, its black blood spilling from its mouth, before it slumped in the saddle, lifeless. But there were too many. One corsair was impaled on a spear, his body writhing as he was lifted into the air, his blood dripping onto the sand below. Another was crushed beneath a Kroxigor's hammer, his torso collapsing inward, his bones turned to pulp in an instant. The Blackfang loomed ahead, so close, but the Seraphon were too fast. And then Vaedrith made a choice. The ultimate betrayal. She raised the Warpstone high, its green light pulsing, and she called upon the curse. The runes seared into her flesh, ignited, and suddenly the very air itself twisted, the veil between realms thinning. From the shadows something answered. The jungle convulsed, and then the dead began to rise. Not just the corsairs, but ancient warriors, fallen Seraphon from wars long past, their bones animated by dark power, their hollow eyes burning with spectral fire. The battlefield erupted into madness as the undead clashed with the living, their swords flashing, their shields raised in eternal defiance. It was enough. Vaedrith ran, reaching the Blackfang's gangplank, shoving aside the few remaining corsairs who stood in her way. She had the Warpstone. She had power. And that was all that mattered. The sea calls. The survivors scrambled onto the ship, cutting the ropes, the oars biting into the water. Vaedrith stood at the stern, watching as Lustria burned behind them, the jungle choked with war and undeath, the Seraphon roaring in defiance. She had survived, but at what cost? The Warpstone still pulsed in her hand, its whispers growing louder. And deep within, something inside her had already begun to change. The tides of chaos had claimed her, and there would be no turning back. Chapter 13. The Blackfang Burns. A ship bound for damnation. The Blackfang surged through the river's brackish waters, its tattered sails flapping like wounded wings, the hull still slick with the blood of its dying crew. The survivors, a pitiful handful of corsairs, stood on deck, clutching their wounds, their faces hollow with exhaustion, terror, and betrayal. The jungle was far behind them, but Lustria was not done with them yet. In the distance, the war drums of the Seraphon still echoed through the mist, and the sky, once blackened by the fires of sorcery, now churned with an unnatural green hue. The Warpstone hoard was aboard the ship, pulsing like a cursed heart, veins of corrupting energy slithering through the wood, twisting it into grotesque, living flesh. The very timbers groaned, whispering in 1,000 voices, some pleading, some mocking, others laughing in tongues not meant for mortal ears. And Captain Vaedrith Nightbane stood at the ship's helm, staring into the warp-born abyss she had created. Her fingertips burned, the Slann's curse still etched into her skin, throbbing with eldritch agony. The Warpstone had marked her, and its whispers had grown louder, clawing at her mind, offering promises of endless power. But there was only one way this could end. She turned to her remaining corsairs, a handful of bloodied survivors, their eyes sunken, their minds fraying. Among them was Salat Vain, still alive but barely, his breath labored, a gaping wound carved into his side, one of his arms hanging uselessly. There was also Lysaith Velcor, the sorceress, her ashen face unreadable, her robes still wet with the blood of the dead, her gaze locked onto Vaedrith with something between fury and admiration. "Earn it." Vaedrith's voice was calm, absolute. The corsairs blinked. Some hesitated, some clutched at their packs, their pockets lined with cursed treasures, unwilling to accept that everything they had bled for was about to be undone. Salat let out a ragged laugh, shaking his head. "You're finally afraid of what you've stolen." Vaedrith's eyes gleamed in the unnatural light. "Not afraid. I simply refuse to let anyone else have it." She drew her dagger, and without hesitation sliced open her palm, letting her own blood drip onto the ship's deck. Set it alight. The first flames. The corsairs moved, some silently, others grudgingly, but none dared to question her again. Torches were lit, their flames licking hungrily at the dry wood of the cargo hold. Oil casks were smashed, their contents spilling across the deck, soaking the warp-tainted planks in a slick sheen of flammable death. The first tongues of fire took root, spreading with unnatural speed, twisting in colors that should not exist, violet, emerald, and abyssal black. The ship shuddered beneath them as though it knew. The Warpstone shrieked, its sickly glow pulsing violently, trying to cling to the vessel, to spread, to consume. Something was resisting the flames. Something alive. Lyseth narrowed her eyes. "It doesn't want to burn." Vaedrith gritted her teeth. "Then we'll make it suffer." The sorceress raised her hands, her fingers curling into arcane shapes, her mouth moving in whispers too low for mortals to hear. A wave of midnight fire erupted from her palms, spreading through the sails, the masts, the cursed hull, and suddenly the ship was screaming. It was alive. It knew it was dying. The Blackfang's death throes. The ship buckled violently, the very wood warping, shifting, trying to reshape itself into something monstrous. The figurehead at the prow, a carved demonic serpent, let out a real, guttural snarl, its eyes flaring with warp fire, its mouth stretching open to reveal a pulsing maw of green-lit madness. The deck erupted, jagged tendrils of cursed wood bursting forth, impaling corsairs, wrapping around their legs and throats, pulling them screaming into the growing inferno. One reaver, Dareth, let out a gargled cry as the ship itself dragged him into its depths. His face disappearing into the splintering, breathing wood, his muffled screams ending in a wet crunch. Another corsair, driven mad by the Warpstone's influence, fell to his knees laughing, his flesh melting, his body warping into something with too many limbs, too many eyes, too many mouths. Vaedrith did not look back. There was no saving them. To the boats, now. Escape into the abyss. The lifeboat splashed into the water, cutting through the reflection of the burning monstrosity that had once been their ship. Vaedrith leapt aboard, dragging Saleth with her, his body weak, shaking but still breathing. Lysith followed, her face illuminated by the burning horror behind them. Only a handful made it off the ship alive. As they rowed, the Blackfang gave its final death cry, a low, reverberating wail, as if something ancient and vengeful was being dragged into oblivion. Then the Warpstone erupted. The explosion was blinding, a column of green fire spearing into the sky, the very ocean recoiling, waves churning violently as if the gods themselves had turned their eyes upon this blasphemous display. The ship was gone. There was nothing left but fire and ruin. And as Vaedrith sat, panting, clutching her blade, watching the embers of her empire sink beneath the waves, she felt nothing. Nothing but the cold certainty that she had not escaped anything at all. The curse was still with her. The Warpstone had left its mark. And far in the distance, beyond the burning wreckage, the Lizardmen watched from the jungle's edge. They did not pursue. They did not need to. The jungle had already won. Vaedrith clutched the last fragment of Warpstone hidden in her coat, feeling its pulse against her skin, and for the first time in her life, she truly understood what it meant to be damned. Chapter 14. A Pyrrhic Victory. Drifting into damnation. The lifeboat rocked violently as it was pulled further into the endless, churning sea, leaving behind the burning remains of the Blackfang, now nothing more than a smoldering scar upon the horizon. The sky above them was wrong, no longer the familiar storm-laden black of Naggaroth's coasts, nor the suffocating twilight of Lustria. It was unnatural, the clouds twisting, their shapes curling into alien spirals, pulsing with faint traces of eldritch green. The oars creaked as the last survivors rowed with hollowed eyes and blood-stained hands, their bodies scarred by battle, exhaustion, and something worse. Something that could not be seen, but could be felt beneath their skin. Vaedrith sat at the bow, her fingers clenching the last fragment of Warpstone, feeling its pulse against her palm like a second heart beating within her flesh. The Slann's magic had marked them, and she knew without doubt that none of them had truly escaped. The first signs of the curse. The first to break was Corsair Dalanis. His breath came shallow, his pallid face drenched in sweat as he twitched where he sat. His hands trembled, nails scratching at the wood of the lifeboat as if something inside him was trying to get out. "It won't stop," he muttered. His voice was cracked, desperate, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. "Won't stop," Syleth rasped, barely able to sit up, his wounded body still slick with blood. Delenis turned to him, and then he began to scream. The corsairs recoiled as he convulsed violently, his body shuddering, his skin bulging in places as if things writhed beneath the surface. Then, with a horrific, wet, tearing sound, his left arm split open, the flesh peeling away to reveal something chitinous and wrong, a twisted mass of barbed bone, pulsing with warp taint. "Get it out of me! Get it out!" he wailed, his own fingers digging into the wound, tearing at his own flesh, clawing at the unnatural growth. Vaedrith watched, expression unreadable, as Delenis shrieked and thrashed, his body contorting into something no longer Druki. Then she stood, raised her cutlass, and ended it. The blade fell, severing his throat, his blood spraying across the lifeboat, coating the sweating, hollow faces of the remaining crew. His body twitched once, twice, and then lay still, his mutated arm curling lifelessly against his chest. Silence. Then Lysaeth spoke. "This is only the beginning." The curse revealed. The sorceress sat at the stern, her pale hands wrapped around her knees, her dark eyes staring into the abyss beyond the waves. "We were warned, Vaedrith," she murmured. Vaedrith turned, her expression cold. "Spare me the riddles, witch. Say what you mean." Lysaeth's lips curled, her black-stained fingers tracing the glowing runes still burned into her own flesh. "The Slann did not kill us, because that was never their plan." She lifted her gaze, her eyes gleaming with something ancient and terrible. "They bound us to something worse." The ocean hissed, and for a moment the air shimmered, as if the veil between worlds had grown paper-thin. Zalith clenched his jaw. "You mean to say we're cursed?" Lysaeth smiled grimly. "I mean to say we are no longer truly alive." The whispers of the Warpstone. Vaedrith said nothing. She could still feel the Warpstone, its heat against her palm, its whispers twisting around her thoughts like a strangler vine around a corpse. It promised her things, promised power beyond reckoning, whispered of vengeance, of slaughter, of a throne built from the bones of those who defied her. She could feel it crawling through her veins, changing her, just as it had begun to change the others. She exhaled slowly, feeling no fear, only certainty. Lustria had not been the end. It had been the beginning. She turned to her remaining crew, those few who still breathed, still clung to the last frayed strands of sanity. "This is not over," she whispered. "Not until I say it is." Saleth's remaining eye darkened, his lips curling in a mixture of amusement and resignation. "Then what now, O glorious captain?" Vaedrith's fingers tightened around the Warpstone, and a smile, slow, sharp, and full of cruel intent, crept across her face. "Now we go home, and we remind them why they should fear us. The fate that follows." The lifeboat drifted onward, swallowed by the horizon, carried by winds that should not have been blowing, toward a land that would no longer welcome them. But the Slann's will still clung to them. Their curse was eternal, and though they had escaped Lustria, Lustria would never escape them. Chapter 15. The Call of the Void. The Shores of Naggaroth. The lifeboat drifted through the mist-choked waters of the Sea of Malice, its blackened hull scarred and broken, a ghost of the once mighty Blackfang. The survivors, if they could still be called that, sat silently within it, their skeletal faces hollow, their bodies twisted by wounds that would never truly heal. Naggaroth's ice-crusted cliffs loomed ahead, the great towering gates of Clar Carond rising from the blackened stone, their spiked ramparts casting jagged shadows over the turbulent sea. Once, this had been home. Now it felt like a cage. Vaedrith watched the city draw near, her fingers still clenched around the Warpstone shard, feeling its pulse align with her own. It had not stopped whispering. Not since Lustria. Not since the curse had been laid upon them. And as the first sentries of the Drakau's forces spotted the lifeboat, their spears raised, their crossbows drawn, she knew what they saw. Not corsairs returning in triumph, but wraiths returning from the grave. Exile among her own. The courts of Naggaroth had no love for weakness. When Vaedrith and her remaining crew crawled ashore, they were met with cold gazes and whispered. The Drakau of Claire Carond, a wraithen noble dressed in robes of crimson and gold, did not greet her with the honors she once commanded. Instead, he listened to her story of Lustria, of the treasures lost, of the ship consumed in eldritch fire, with an expression of thinly veiled contempt. And then, with a single gesture, she was cast out, exiled from the city she had once ruled upon the waves. Her name, once spoken with fear and respect, was now a curse among the corsair lords. A failure. A cursed soul. A disgrace. But Vaedrith did not break. She did not beg. She did not despair, because she still had the Warpstone, and it still had plans for her. The gathering of the damned. The docks of Haggrafe were always hungry for new blood. This was where the exiles, the mutineers, the disgraced warriors of the Drukei came to vanish, to become something more terrible than they had ever been before. It was here that Vaedrith rebuilt herself. Her first recruit was Saleth Vane, his body still scarred from the battles in Lustria, his left eye a pulsing socket of warp taint, something unholy flickering in its depths. He was not the same elf who had once stood at her side. But neither was she. She found killers, traitors, sorcerers too dangerous even for the Black Arcs, and she forged them into something new. A new crew, a new purpose, one that did not fear the warp's touch, one that would sail where none dared to go, one that would return to Lustria not as invaders, but as something far worse. The call of the Warpstone. The nights in Haggrafe were cold, the winds whipping through the alleyways, bringing with them the scent of blood and ambition. Vaedrith sat alone in her private quarters, the Warpstone shard resting on a blackened altar before her. It glowed softly, its sickly green light casting twisted shadows across the walls. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with images. She saw Lustria, the swamps, the ruins, the vaults buried beneath the earth, filled with secrets never meant for mortals to claim. She saw the Slann, their corporeal bodies long dead, but their wills still watching. And she saw herself, standing atop a burning black ark, her eyes glowing with power, her laughter echoing through the halls of the damned. She exhaled slowly, feeling the madness settling deeper, the Slann's curse burning in her blood, binding her to the fate she had stolen from them. There was no peace left for her. Only vengeance. Only power. Only Lustria. She rose, gripping the Warpstone, her nails digging into the tainted flesh of her palm, and whispered a single command to the darkness. Prepare the ship. We sail at dawn. The endless cycle of blood and betrayal. The sea was never meant to be kind to the Drukei. It was a place of violence, of betrayal, of hunger that could never be sated. And yet it welcomed her back, just as the Warpstone welcomed her, just as Lustria called to her once more. For Vaedrith Nightbane, the Blackfang's destruction had not been the end. It had been a rebirth. And when she returned, when she set foot upon the jungle's cursed soil once more, she would not come as a thief. She would come as a conqueror, as a monster, as something far worse than the elves who had fallen before her. The sea whispered her name. And she smiled, because the call of the void had finally claimed her soul, and she had never felt more alive.